All right, thank you everyone so much for coming. And hi, and welcome to our second webinar of 2024 for our Sea Level Rise and Storm Surge webinar series. So my name is Audrey Brown, and I'm currently a scientist in the Parks intern for sea level rise and sediment and shoreline management. With this webinar series, we're looking to dive deeper into specific topics and projects at coastal parks and beyond. And it's ultimately our goal to discuss and share ideas and resources. So I've got the link here for previous webinars. This is using PowerPoint Live, so you can actually click on it, and I'll also drop it in the chat as well. We hope to continue this series on a quarterly basis later on in the year. If there's a particular topic or project that anyone would like to let us know about, please feel free to get in touch or drop your thoughts in the chat. For today, we're very excited to welcome our speakers from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. Dr. Hannah Baranes leads GMRI's Coastal Dynamics Lab, where she primarily studies changes in mean and extreme coastal and estuarine water levels to support coastal management, flood forecasting and preparedness, and state rulemaking. Gayle Bowness leads the Institute's Municipal Climate Action Program, where she engages coastal communities to support better understanding of local climate impacts and provide them with the knowledge, skills, and tools they need to develop community-focused and data-driven resilience plans to thrive in a warming world. Meggie Harvey works as part of the education team to support youth in getting involved in active research related to climate-driven changes in Gulf of Maine ecosystems. Before coming to GMRI, she taught 7th grade science in Chicago Public Schools. And last but not least, Abigail Long is part of the education team, where she supports youth and educator involvement in community science projects across a number of climate-related topics in the Gulf of Maine ecosystems. The title of their presentation today is going to be Assessing Coastal Flood Risk with Maine Communities. Thank you all again for joining. The presenters, please feel free to share your PowerPoint and take it from here.
Great, thanks so much, Audrey, and thanks for that introduction as well. I'll be kicking things off while Hannah pulls up our slideshow, and she'll be navigating. So apologies as we're like kind of directing each other when to bebop around to the next slide. So I'll take a minute just to orient you all to the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and kind of the work we do broadly, the place that we're working in, and kind of kick off the project that we'll be sharing with you all today. And although as it's in the title, we're doing this work with Maine, our intent is to develop a framework or a process that can be really transferable everywhere. So please dig in and invite questions on that, as we really want to think about how we can support disseminating this work to other areas. All right, Hannah. Thanks. Great. So at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, as you can see, we have a mission to develop and to deliver collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. And we really see that climate change is really the challenge of our time. You can go to the next slide, Hannah. Climate change is amongst kind of one of our 4 focus areas as an organization. And just for reference, we're a nonprofit institute, no direct affiliations with academia, although we do collaborate with them quite a bit. And we're really kind of in that kind of boundary organization as far as working with communities. And we're about a staff size of about 100. We kind of balloon up a little bit in the summertime with interns. So as I was saying, climate change being kind of like the major kind of challenge of our times, but our work also digs into supporting seafood sustainability, healthy ocean ecosystems, and really thinking about kind of that land-based connection, like a thriving blue economy. But today we'll really be diving into climate change. Thanks, Hannah. And this being a threat that we are feeling everywhere, climate change is not something that is just going to happen to us in the future. It's been something that we've been experiencing and living with for many decades. And that rate of change, whether we're talking about drought, extreme precipitation, or as we'll be talking about today, sea level rise, that rate of change has just been increasing. Next slide. So with our work, we're not just bringing the climate projections, which can hold a lot of heavy emotions and heavy feelings with them into communities, but also wanting to bring into that conversation at the onset, how do we start to envision our communities to thrive under these conditions? And what does a thriving community look like? And in our instance, what does a thriving coastal community look like? So we have communities with sustainable fisheries, which have diversified economies, and uh, we're in a society that is climate literate, and all of these choices and decisions and have been made along the way to really focus on equity and justice within communities as well. All right, next slide. So as an organization, we really work across kind of across this framework of science, engagement, and solutions, bringing cutting edge research to communities as we're better understanding how climate is impacting us. And here in our corner of the North Atlantic and the Gulf of Maine, we're experiencing rates of warming greater than most of the world's oceans. So we really see this as kind of a living laboratory where we can learn a lot about climate impacts here and how to respond as communities. And that response really comes through on that engagement. And that engagement is really intergenerational. We're fortunate as an institute, as a research institute, to have a solid foundation in education by having an education team that really works across the organization and brings K-12 resources into all of the work that we do. And so through science and through engagement, we support communities and or the stakeholders that we're working with to solutions, whether that's thinking about kind of climate responses, sustainable seafood, and some of those other categories we mentioned earlier. All right, next slide. So just to frame us in place, we're in Maine. Maine is home to 144 coastal communities. And why that's significant is that our communities are also, we drive our decision making through local control. So kind of that local control or home rule. So each community has or is in charge of making their own decisions as to how they want to respond and plan for climate solutions. Decisions aren't made at a county or even a state level, although guidance can come from the state. At the end of the day, those decisions come down to those communities. And so amongst those 144 coastal communities, the majority are rural. And when we talk about rural, and this may be something that you guys experience as well, as a lot of national parks are in more rural areas, we kind of are more of like the micro rural. A lot of folks consider a small town being 20,000 folks. We're like, no, how about like 250? So that's the scale of some of these communities that we're working with. Really small communities that may have a lot of social resilience as they know their neighbors and have a deep sense of place, but are also really vulnerable to climate change because they may not have the resources to respond to those. All right, next slide. So thinking about impacts and responses, that's what, and the ability to respond, kind of what these two graphics show us. So we'll start looking at kind of the pink and purple map of the coast of Maine. And if you're familiar with Maine, kind of down in the southern Maine area, we've got like low-lying beaches, large salt marshes. Mid-coast Maine, kind of moving into the middle area here, is a bit of a mix where we're starting to introduce some rocky cliffs. And then what we call down east or up north by the Canadian border is where there's a lot of high rocky cliff areas. So naturally, as you go up the coast, the amount of land lost due to sea level rise is going to decrease because of those high rocky cliffs. But the social vulnerability, and primarily thinking about the economic reliance on the coast and the economic ability of communities to respond, increases as you go up the coast. And since we're talking about national parks today too, you can see Mount Desert Island. Hannah, I don't know if you're able to like move your mouse onto like scroll around that, but that's the home to Acadia National Park. It's kind of right in between the mid-coast and down east. And if you look at that, you can see there's a couple different colors of purples and blues, and that's because there's different social vulnerabilities as well as different impacts of sea level rise there. So as we're thinking about how to address and support climate impacts within Acadia National Park, just understanding that those impacts aren't the same throughout, even just that one park system. And kind of the same goes as we look over towards the like orange, yellow, red map. This is showing us the resilience capacity for planning. So which communities have a dedicated municipal staff to support them with planning and or a regional planning office that can support the county with planning. And kind of no surprise, Southern Maine is kind of more equipped than Mid-Coast, and in particular down east, you can see has a lot of red. Good news is that this map is changing, although this one is rather recent. Just last year, I was chatting with the woman at the state of Maine who produced this map, Judy East, and she noted that it's already out of date. So it's great that Maine is starting to move in the direction of having more capacity, but compared to urban centers, it's still pretty low capacity. And again, to note, if you look at Mount Desert Island, kind of the divide between blue and orange there. Bar Harbor on one side of the island has more capacity to support climate planning than the other 3 communities that make up the island. And the 4 communities, I think all of them encompass Acadia National Park as a part of all 4 of those towns. Great. All right, so that's Maine. So just to introduce the project that we'll be chatting about today and kind of why it came about. They've been doing this work in communities for almost 10 years, thinking about sea level rise and climate impacts. And a question that we've been hearing over and over again is, well, that's great now that sea level is rising, we have that data, but exactly at what point in our community is it going to flood? So like what water level and weather conditions are going to lead to local flooding? And prior to this project, you'll see a map later to see how it's improved. There's 4 or 5 NOAA tide gauges throughout the coast of Maine. Only 3 of these gauges have been in place for I think more than 80 years, where they're able to have this long range data to support predictions well into the future. But Maine has over 5,000 miles of tidally influenced coastline if you look at all of our tidal rivers and our islands. So these 5 tide gauges just aren't enough to help us answer this question about what water level and weather conditions lead to local flooding. And that's really what's inspired us to apply for and fortunately receive a grant from NSF's Civic Innovation Challenge. Thanks, Hannah. So we are about 2/3 of the way through this 1-year project. Again, we're intending to build a framework to support other communities and similar processes, and we'll talk about that throughout. But for this project, we're piloting a process in 4 coastal Maine communities to support a better understanding what those local water level impacts are, what the measurements are, and what that means for communities. And we're doing so by bringing technology in the form of low-cost tide gauges into communities, installing those, pairing that with community science, and also, again, really focused on that intergenerational engagement and the opportunities for youth to become leaders in their communities and supporting and visioning a thriving future under climate change. So we'll dive into each of those activities in just a minute, but we're striving towards, just to point out these outcomes of having data that supports the National Weather Service and their flood forecasts, as well as data platforms and engagement tools and financing for communities to build that coastal resilience. All right, so I'm going to pass things over to Hannah to talk about the science and technology.
All right, thanks. Can I get a thumbs up if somebody can hear me? Okay. All right, great. So the conversation on coastal flooding and sea level rise in Maine has really moved forward a lot in just the past year. I don't know where you all are from. I wish we I'd thought to ask you in the chat, but I think most of you might not be from Maine. And this past year, we experienced these two back-to-back winter storms that I think one of the more staggering statistics I've heard is that they either damaged or destroyed 60 to 70% of Maine's working waterfront. The image I've put up here, this is kind of one of the impacts that got a lot of press nationally from Acadia National Park. There's a shipwreck from 1911. I'm sure there's someone on this call who knows way more about this than I do, but my understanding is that this shipwreck was uncovered on January 10th by these huge waves that we don't typically, haven't seen much in the past with winter storms that were just moving a lot more material than we've seen historically. And then it was uncovered. It was this really exciting thing, but then boom, another storm hit that had unprecedented impacts on January 13th and ended up causing some damage to this historical wreck. So this is all to say that sea level rise is already impacting the Maine coast, and this work feels very timely. These two events are often talked about in the news as record-breaking storms, but in the Gulf of Maine, we don't really get kind of these anomalous, big sort of black swan events the way that places that are impacted by hurricanes do. So we more experience flooding from winter storms that don't have as high maximum wind speeds as hurricanes do. So we're not going to get a Hurricane Sandy or a Hurricane Katrina. Instead, what happened this year is these were just kind of run-of-the-mill storms that were it was unlucky they hit at high tide, but what was really bad is that they hit on top of higher sea level. So this chart on the left is showing annual measured average sea level at the Portland tide gauge from the early 1900s to present. And you can see this sort of upward trend that we've all become quite familiar with caused by human emissions. But also you can see these wiggles that represent interannual variability that are due to variations in atmospheric pressure, prevailing wind, currents, salinity, temperature. And in 2023, we experienced this abrupt 8-centimeter rise in sea level. And then in January 2024, when these storms hit, sea level was even higher. And so these pictures on the right, I showed you all the picture from Acadia, but these are some of kind of the more extreme overland flooding impacts we saw during those two events. So lots of flooding of working waterfronts. This is a dike down east in Machias. That's sort of a major transportation corridor for commuters and people who live in the town, got completely flooded and was pretty severely damaged. There's some historic infrastructure that was lost. And then on top of these sort of more extreme events, we've also just seen a lot of really routine kind of sunny day flooding. I don't know if you can tell in this picture in the upper left, but that's the moon up there. So that's just sort of routine high tide flooding on a clear sky day because of this rise in sea level. So this feels, it's an important thing to think about what the impact of just the historical sea level rise we've seen is, because in the next slide, I'm going to take this historical record and collapse it down to just one corner. And so here's that black line from the last slide. So not counting the spike in the last year, we've seen about 8 inches of sea level rise in the Gulf of Maine in the last 100 years. In contrast to that, Maine is committing to manage 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050. This is relative to the year 2000, and 4 feet in 2100. And so if we think about kind of the challenges that just 8 inches have brought so far, it becomes really critical to start answering that question that Gayle posed in the beginning. What is the impact in my community? How can I be prepared for it? And what do we do? All right, so this is a slide that I've often showed to classrooms when I've gone to talking to kids, and sort of just to put Gayle's question into pictures. The National Weather Service, in the same way they put out weather forecasts, they actually also put out flood forecasts. So at certain points along the coast, a forecaster might tell you water levels are going to reach 13.5 feet on Tuesday. But if you're sitting with Knox County Emergency Management Agency, or if you're a town manager, 13.5 feet doesn't really tell you what you need to do. So a bit later on, Gayle, Meggie, and Abigail will kind of talk about how we're going about this question. And I'll talk a bit about how we are improving and supporting forecasting by installing tide gauges. So here's in Maine, here's what those coastal flood forecasts look like. So I just clicked on Portland here. The blue is showing measured water level, and the purple is showing forecasted water level. I don't know if you all have heard the saying, all models are wrong, some are useful. So there is a model that the National Weather Service runs, and that helps them gets these numbers for like forecasted water level into the future. It's run continuously along the coast, but again, models need to be verified against data, and we're sort of pretty limited in the places we have data or real-time measurements of coastal water levels to compare the model to. So forecasters at the 2 offices in Maine, in coastal Maine and Caribou and Gray, they will run their model, and then in places where there's a tide gauge, they'll compare forecasted to measured, and they'll say, oh, for the last 2 high tides, our model was biased or it was off, maybe it was half a foot too low, and they'll use that to bump up the forecast to match observations. So it's written here on the right, forecasts are more reliable when there's a tide gauge to manually bias correct water level models. NOAA tide gauge installations are expensive and difficult to, or they're expensive to maintain and a lot of work to maintain, but there's been a kind of big boom in folks producing low cost alternatives that they don't provide like the millimeter scale accuracy that we need for tracking long-term changes in sea level, for example, but we can get centimeter level accuracy, which is perfectly adequate for some of the like community engagement applications we'll talk about and for bias correcting these forecasts. So we've partnered with Hohonu. They're a startup that's spun out of the University of Hawaii who's designed these gauges. So there's 2 types we've tested installing. One is an ultrasonic gauge, so it shoots ultrasound down at the water surface, and the time it takes to travel back up, there's a temperature correction in there too. It uses that to figure out distance to water. We use GNSS equipment to essentially measure the elevation of the gauge so we can convert that distance to water measurement to an actual elevation, which is what you need for water level when you're thinking about flooding. We've also tested out a radar gauge, and that's what's shown in this picture on the right. The sensor is just, it's this piece is the sensor instead of just this like little cone. We actually have an ultrasonic and a radar installed next to each other on this one. These are awesome. So for those of you who have taken water level measurements, you might have used pressure transducers that you have to put underwater. So you have to get it at the right time to install them. Stuff happens, the stuff that goes underwater, it's hard to keep out in the winter. You have to retrieve it to get the data. These, they have a little solar panel on them, and there's a they have telemetry in them, so it just transmits data over the cell network. They can do radio if there's no cell connection where you want to install your gauge. And then everything is open access. So we have our grant funding. It's a data subscription model. So we have our grant funding and annual subscription service for these gauges. And there's this publicly accessible data portal where you can go and you can just click on these gauges and see real-time water levels. There's also, for example, we're partnering with the aquarium, the Department of Marine Resources Aquarium. There's an API that some of their people are using to grab the data to turn into an exhibit. So there's, yeah, it's a really great sort of platform and group to work with. Okay, and I'm gonna pass it off again.
Great, thanks, Hannah. So me again for a little bit. So I'm going to chat about the community science project and kind of how it came to be. And kind of great that we're getting these like water level monitors out there, but the question behind this project really comes down to is like, so what if a water level monitor says it's going to be a 12-foot tide or 12-foot water level, if you don't know where that water is going to be, what impact it's going to have on the community, if there's going to be flooding, what areas would flood, what ecosystems might be flooding more frequently, and then how do you respond and or plan for that if you do know there's going to be flooding at certain locations. And so the only way to really answer that question is to get folks out to observe these high water events and or storm events. And community science is a great way of doing that because you can really lean into like large groups of people to go out to lots of places at the same time as a high tide and make these observations. Community science also provides a mechanism for engagement, providing folks with something to do where they can feel agency and supporting their communities and addressing climate impacts, and also build their knowledge about what the current impacts are within their communities and what might be causing it. What are those drivers behind sea level rise and behind climate change? And then the end result is that we'll have data. We'll have local data for local decision makers to support them in planning, emergency planners, and as we've noted earlier, for the National Weather Service to improve those models. And we'll also have a more informed community, coastal community that is ready to engage in decision-making processes as well, and has the knowledge to identify when and how to engage, and also has that knowledge to provide informed input into decision-making processes. So we launched this project in 2020, which you all know is a really interesting time to launch this work. And so we had mostly kind of, again, virtual engagement at that time. But since then, and also because Maine has been experiencing an increase in the amount of sunny day flooding and storm events in this past couple of years, kind of the energy and interest in this project has really increased infinitely in recent years. So through this project, again, we've been able to expand to 4 additional communities. Go to the next slide, Hannah. And when we work with communities to support them in joining, we work with the local decision makers to identify areas where they want data to inform their decisions, to ensure that data being collected is going to be used, and also that local decision makers are aware of the project and would use that data. So we look for areas that are publicly accessible, safe to access, areas that are vulnerable to flooding either today or would be in the near future, and also wanting to identify areas that represent the diversity of flood impacts within a community. So thinking about impacts to roads and infrastructure, to local businesses, to places of ecosystem services importance, to places of cultural or social importance. So this is showing you a screenshot of some coastal flood monitoring sites that we have in one of the towns we're working with in Machias, Maine, which is a little bit further down east from Acadia National Park. But it's a great way to start to engage communities in the process. Just to note that folks can upload and collect data from anywhere at any time, but we do want to really hone in data collection in areas that are going to be most useful. Right, next slide. So we worked with the National Weather Service, Maine Geological Survey, and NOAA's Office of Coastal Management on developing a community science data collection protocol. And we also worked with community resilience committees. And so that way we were getting input directly from communities as to the questions that they would want to ask and the information that would be most useful to them. This data collection protocol is online. This is a QR code to the website if you want to scan that, and I'm sure we can share this out later as well. So it's an online form, a lot of drop downs to answer questions about what folks are observing from weather observations, like the type of precipitation that might be occurring, wind strength, the weather conditions you're observing around flooding, flood depth, the wave action, and then inviting photos from folks, up to I think 6 photos from each of the sites that each of the observations that may be doing, and then also tagging those photos about what people are observing. Like, is it high water? Is there no flooding? Are you looking at a high water mark? Is there erosion? Do you see damage? Really wanting to get some more detail about what people are observing during these events. And then we also ask questions about who they are and what their role is within the community, what it is that they're concerned about, their level of concern around this event, how this event makes them feel, and any suggestions that they may have as far as what types of actions they'd like to see at this location. And we also invite stories of how they have seen this site change over time, really wanting to lean into what that local data is, and also knowing the kind of impact to residents and the communities for these events. Right, next slide. And so as I mentioned, this is a project that we're about 2/3 of the way through. So this is a sneak peek. We're also developing a data viewer. Currently, we just see a list of observations, but within this data viewer, we're working to kind of geolocate these observations, have them alongside that water level data, add in a lot of filters so people can sort through geographic area, time, type of event that was being witnessed, and really supporting kind of that end use by various stakeholders from land use planners, emergency managers, National Weather Service, community planners, and we also view educators as an audience as well, how to make this data tool useful to students. So I'm going to pass things over to Abigail and Meggie to chat about how we are engaging communities in this work, and in particular youth.
Great. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about our community engagement strategies, and then I'll send it over to Meggie to talk more about youth specifically. But to engage folks in this project during this high water season, so this was from about January to April, we actually saw some high water in May as well. We focused on the high water happening in February, March, and April, and had a virtual discussion series prior to the high tides of each month, and then following those high tides. So each of the pre-high tide presentations were around different topics with different groups of experts. And so it allowed for an intergenerational audience to come together and have a Q&A, kind of much like this webinar going on, where we're able to all come together around one topic. And then from there, we left it as a call to action. So we let people go out during the high water during those few days each month and make observations following those community science protocols. And then following that, we were able to gather together and just have an open discussion, allowing people to share what they saw that month, what they maybe saw in the past, compare across communities, really get those novel stories, have a place for people to share those emotions, and ask questions and have ideas for planning, and really grow a community around these projects. Next slide. So we can't be everywhere at once during this high water. So we were really fortunate to partner with a number of community-based organizations that were able to host a lot of the engagement around this project. So in this photo, you can see a bunch of folks heading out together to do the community science project. This is from St. George, where we partnered with Haringgut, which is a science center, but we partnered with a few organizations, so land trusts, science centers. We even had folks from conservation commissions, resilience committees, really just interested groups of people who want to come together and host the engagement around these projects. And it's really a unique opportunity for them to provide their own local knowledge and their own unique perspective that we can't necessarily provide ourselves, and just have a way for you to be in community together, observing these impacts. Especially as both Hannah and Gayle mentioned, we saw some pretty devastating impacts along the coast of Maine. So to come together as a community, witness those together and have those conversations was really powerful in creating that sense of agency. So here too, they hosted these coastal meetups, which is also another opportunity to just get folks engaged and trained on the community science protocol, so that hopefully then they feel secure enough to go out and do it themselves. Next slide. So to support a lot of these organizations, we created a community engagement package. And this is also linked on that community science page that Gayle mentioned before. And this has a number of resources from social media templates, brochures, a facilitator guide. It even has some language about how to talk about the project, and has some other relevant coastal flooding resources. Most of these are pretty local to Maine, but also just resources on how to talk about sea level rise, coastal flooding in general. We also created signage. So at those monitoring sites that Gayle spoke about, there are signs going up in each community. Each of them are unique to that community, so they have a photo that is local and shows that there's some partnership with the town, but those are a great way for people to also access the project as well. Next slide. So here are just a few examples of some of those templates in action and some of that information in action. So the one on the left is a flood alert that the city of Portland put out. So these are editable templates that we created that they could just go in, put in that information, and then just post that out. So it was a great way to just get folks ready and prepared for those high tides. And then these other two were coastal flood meetup notices. The one in the middle was using, again, one of the templates that we created, but they kind of edited it themselves and added their own perspective and details on what the event was. And then the one on the right, they used a lot of the language that we provided, but also created it again for their own. And they even had a local speaker come in from their resilience committee, which was really great. So it kind of can meet both needs of getting people to submit to that project, but also just having a great community conversation. So that's more of the broad engagement. So I'll send it over to Meggie for the youth.
Thanks, Abigail. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So a number of people have made reference to this being an intergenerational project, and our goals from the beginning, we set goals of really incorporating youth voice and youth participation in supporting these communities in the face of coastal flooding. From our education team's standpoint at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, we also know that youth in classrooms need a science education that is locally relevant and speaks to their own lived experience. And so we have been working for a number of years to try and create learning opportunities that are relevant, meaningful, and have sort of real world impact and relevance. And so through this project, we really sought to kind of support teachers in providing meaningful educational experiences and also support communities in connecting with their youth. And so that's been the focus of our work here so far. So we can go to the next slide. So our goals for our youth engagement specifically are that the youth involved would develop complex understanding of the multiple causes of coastal flooding that they're seeing in their communities. They would be active participants in the coastal flooding community science work that Gayle has talked about, making observations, submitting observations, but then also analyzing the data, looking at the water height data, and applying their learning to inform decision-making in their communities. We also know that it's a lot of work to support youth in doing this, and so we have really focused on supporting teacher partners in each of our communities to be able to get youth involved in doing this work. So the first step was compiling pretty extensive curriculum resources that we worked with partner teachers to develop and pilot, and are continuing to work with our teachers in iterating. And these curriculum resources, they sort of outline a set of learning experiences that are rooted in community values and helping students to highlight and articulate what is most important in their community, and rely on those values as they develop their understanding of coastal flood impacts and their priorities going forward. The work also positions students as really valued members of their community and participants in the shared work of understanding current and potential future flooding impacts. And at the same time, works to really develop their science content knowledge, their scientific practices as they're making observations, submitting data, analyzing data, and also develops science concepts. And so all of this work is aligned to national science standards so that this can be the science curriculum as opposed to an add-on to the science curriculum. We also share this work broadly. It's free, it's downloadable, it's easy to modify, and we really encourage teachers to take it, adapt it, run with it, and use it as they want. And I will just add a note that at Acadia National Park, there is a team that already uses some of our curriculum resources related to a different project, but thought that was a fun connection. And I did provide a link there for our curriculum platform for anybody who wants to explore the resources. So in addition to providing resources, we can jump to the next slide. We also really focus on direct support to teachers. So we do, for this project, we brought together teachers for a 2-day professional learning workshop, where the primary goal was to bring teachers who are doing this work in very different communities up and down the coast together, because they are the best resources to each other as they're trying out pretty innovative and brave learning where they don't quite know what their endpoint of this curriculum will be. So building those connections across a cohort was really an important step in this work. We also brought in some subject matter experts so that the teachers would have the opportunity to learn alongside and from subject matter experts like Hannah and Gayle, who are here on this call. And then we spent lots of time running through some of the activities in the curriculum resources that I talked about, but also reflecting on these resources so that the teachers can adapt them to the needs of their own students. And then finally, we can go to the next slide, Hannah. Throughout the school year, we've been really focused on classroom support as much as we can. And a big piece of that has been facilitating connections across the partners in this project. So Abigail mentioned Maine Coast Heritage Trust and Herring Gut, some of our local partners. So helping to facilitate connections across what the schools are doing and what's happening in the local community has been really exciting. And a lot of our local partners have come into classrooms, and teachers have been connecting students out in the community with some of these partners, so that the work that's happening in the community is really going hand in hand with what students are talking about in classrooms. We also just got out in the field as much as possible to support students as they were making their observations, and chat with them and hear their questions as they're seeing their landscapes change at different water heights. And then a very important piece of the work was also providing funds for travel to field sites when they weren't able to walk, and also for hosting community events. Let's go to the next slide. So from our first school year of this project, we've had some pretty exciting results where in each of the 4 focus communities, the teachers have been introducing sea level rise and coastal flooding content, really building that knowledge of the drivers of coastal flooding. In almost all of the communities, the students have been contributing observations throughout the winter and into the spring, really following this work for months at a time, as opposed to just sort of a quick activity. Students have been meeting with town and city planners in 3 of the communities and really sharing their own priorities and their own ideas when it comes to decision making and planning ahead. In one of the communities, students are leading a project on developing signage that not only communicates about coastal flooding, but also the signage is focused on highlighting community strengths and points of interest in their town, which I think is really neat as well. And next week, we have a bunch of events coming up where students will be sharing with their local community things that they've learned and ideas that they have in terms of planning for resilient communities. So we're really excited about that.
Thanks, Maggie. So I guess I'll wrap it up and then we can open things up to questions. So again, this project is really striving to bring together lots of ideas that may exist in other places in different forms. Like tide gauges are out there, the technology for measuring water levels out there, community science is also out there, but how do we bring kind of those 2 things together in a way that creates more meaning for communities and more meaning for kind of end user decision makers? And then also really giving like community voice and finding an authentic way for youth to engage in the conversations in their communities and to really like drive that vision and that change for becoming more resilient to climate impacts has been another kind of piece of this project that we've really strived to put in there. So I hope you can see some like frameworks in there that would work for the stakeholders that you work with as you're engaging them and understanding climate impacts within your own park systems. And again, also that like kind of solutions piece is to what are those data tools or different projects that we can support that are really coming from communities, again, as they're envisioning what their future will be. How can we make sure that we're bringing that into projects as well moving forward? So yeah, I think that's what we have. Hannah got the final slide. Again, thank you for inviting us to share this work with you and also wanting to acknowledge that there's many, many partners and really incredible humans involved in this work. And again, thanks to funding from NSF, we've been able to do this here in Maine.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. That was a great presentation. We've got a little bit of time here for questions. So if anybody has a question, you can drop it in the chat or you can raise your hand and speak up on the microphone.
I'll ask a question, Audrey.
Oh, okay.
Amanda, go ahead. Sorry, everybody asked that at once.
Go first, Moni.
I was just going to ask about building the relationships with the communities and the partners. Were some of those relationships already established among the project participants, or were those kind of started with this project?
I can take that one and feel free to jump in if you have more to add. Really great question. One thing that's really great about being in Maine is that Maine is kind of like a small town. So if you don't know anybody directly, you know somebody who knows somebody that would be the people to put you in touch with. So we've really like leaned into that to have kind of more personal connections with each of these communities. And then also, again, we're really fortunate to be a research institute that has a really strong education team that for decades has been building relationships with teachers in every community in the state. And so like leaning into those teacher relationships as they're also community members. And likely know somebody who's at the town hall. Because again, we're talking about communities of about 1,500 people. There's not too many degrees of separation. So that's just been really helpful.
I can just add in the small communities, a lot of those relationships already exist, and some of the places where it's just our role has made any small difference is just making the connection of this is work that you're both thinking about and both doing and both interested in connecting with each other. A lot of times in our work we become so siloed, and I think that's especially true in what's happening in schools versus what's happening at the land trusts or at the libraries. And so being able to just to put people in contact around what they are actively interested in that moment has been helpful.
Yeah, maybe just real quick, the nuts and bolts kind of answer there is this was the way NSF does this, you get like a small pilot award and then that narrows down the group and then you can apply for the big award. And so the pilot award was entirely putting together that list of project partners. I did install some tag gauges. I moved all of them. I put like all of them in the wrong place or installed them wrong. So it was, yeah, mostly relationship building.
Great. Thank you all for those answers. I think Deborah raised her hand first, it looks like. If you want to go, Deborah.
Sure. Hi there. I actually live in Bedford, Maine, and so I have a very individual specific question because I'm just curious if you've had much engagement there. I know we definitely saw some serious impacts here from those winter storms. So I imagine you have, but I'm just curious.
Okay, I'll chime in on the climate center side, and then Maggie, you can maybe chat on the EDU side of things. I actually have a pending email in my inbox that I need to get back to from somebody from Biddeford. So great for the prompt, and they'll get that email quicker than normal now. Yeah, so as we were talking, as I looked at that map of kind of how like the different resources for folks in Maine to support decision-making processes, Southern Maine has more resources than the rest of the coast of Maine, and in part that's due to the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, just a really amazing and wonderful regional planning office that has a lot of strengths in supporting communities with climate planning. And since Biddeford and other Southern Maine communities have that great resource, from the climate team perspective, we've been focused more on those communities with less resources. So that's where we've been putting our work. That said, we're open to working with everybody.
And I can just add that we have long relationships with teachers in the Biddeford schools, and I think we have connections to Biddeford Library as well. Because the curriculum work that we've been doing around this coastal flooding project is fairly new, we haven't sort of actively recruited around this project yet, but we will be doing so in the next months.
Okay, great. Thank you. Amanda?
Thanks so much. Exciting to learn about this work. I'm curious, it's great to see that with the community and student work, you're looking at the multiple sources of flooding. And I'm curious if the students are particularly drawn to the storm event ones, or how is the different pieces fitting together, and how they see sea level rise in that context of storms.
I could hop in just with one example from Portland. The teachers that were involved in Portland were super motivated and active to get the students out. And so they showed examples of the storm events to the students, and they brought pictures out with them when they brought students out to look at those areas. But then they continued to bring students out when there weren't storm events, when there was just low tide, regular tides, just like day to day, and then just astronomical high tides. And the students seemed to be very engaged and asking a lot of questions around, like, where does the water go? What happens? Like, how are we seeing this water all the way up here, but then we see it all the way down here? So I think it started a lot of that conversation where the initial spark maybe was that storm and showing this like more rare event, but then they really got interested in kind of what the water looks like at all times, and from there have been like creating all these proposals and things like that. Yeah.
One thing that's just been really fascinating to see is the differences in different communities, right? Where in some very rural places where the schools are basically on the water, or students' homes are right by the water, the sort of changes in the coastline are just, part of their daily lives. But even in a place like Portland, where we're surrounded by water, a lot of students don't really have access to the waterfront or are not familiar with it. And so just the amount of learning around the fact, that we are connected to the coast, that's I think been a huge piece for some of our bigger communities.
Well, great. If anybody has like one last minute question, otherwise we're pretty much at the end of our time today. So I want to thank our speakers so much for that awesome presentation. Thank you everyone who showed up today. We really appreciate it. We will make this recording available on our Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Explore Nature YouTube page. So we'll share that link with everybody, and that'll be made publicly accessible after this as well. So yeah, thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Good work, Aubrey.
Thank you.